And thank you to all of our founding trustees and trustees. I see some of you in the room, patrons and members for making tonight's event possible. I'd particularly like to thank Pengfei, who is over on the right, on my right, our patron, who's based in the Netherlands, who first approached us with the idea of inviting our honored guest, Marc Hijink. I'm going to make the J a Y, like New Jersey, right? New Jersey, okay. I grew up in New Jersey as well, so who is the author of the excellent book, Focus, which is really a story of light, lithography and light. And we are in the city of lights, so I had to get that joke in. But this kind of light is different. This is, we'll have lots of acronyms tonight, but you don't have to know anything about technology to enjoy the book. It's very well written, but it's very humorous. So I enjoyed it very much. But we're talking tonight a lot about extreme ultraviolet light, or EUV, and basically the chip industry and the future of the world, effectively, nothing less than that. And we are joined tonight by esteemed French journalist Pierre Haski, who's a veteran of Asia, where I first know him way too many years ago in Beijing. I can't even remember how long ago it was. So has deep insights into Asia, but also geopolitics, which this industry is all about. And in your book, Marc, you write a lot about how ASML, this almost unpronounceable, terrible name company, I keep thinking ADSL. My friends were saying, is it about Wi-Fi? I said, no. But ASML is a very, actually you talk about a BBC documentary that called it a sort of
a relatively obscure company.
Yeah. Relatively obscure, but worth latest is I think $350 billion US, I think the latest.
Their market cap.
Yeah,
They're doing quite good.
So for Europe, that's not too bad in technology. And so we're going to be diving in tonight to this company, to this industry, and the links with geopolitics, the future of Europe in a world where we see the US ever ascendant in the economy and technology. Politically, we'll talk about that later, but in terms of the power of US tech. And yet, here in Europe, there's this fascinating company that has emerged, very much connected to Asia as well, and we are the Asia Society. Now, I think, Marc, I'm going to invite you to maybe give a little introduction to, and Pengfei?
Let me, before we start, I just want to...
It works.
Okay. Yeah, before we start, I just want to gauge the audience a little bit and do a little quick survey. So raise your hand if you guys have heard of ASML before the event as a company. Okay. If you Wikipedia ASML, when you saw the event title, it doesn't count. All right, so keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Okay.
Okay, that's... Okay,
okay, cool.
Marc, so, you've done a good job.
Yeah, I'm leaving now. Okay.
And online, we'll look on the online record as well.
So keep your hands up, keep your hands up if you guys know why ASML dominates the market.
That's why they're here.
Okay.
Some of them. Okay.
All right, a little bit less. Okay, and keep your hands up if you guys know what the heck a lithography machine is.
Lithography?
Yeah, lithography machine.
It's not linguini, it's, yeah, sorry.
Okay, much less. So, kind of interesting. So I'm going to hand over to Marc right now, and he's going to give us an overview of the company ASML, and also kind of an overview of how the chips war came about and the evolution of it. Yeah, on to you, Marc.
Thank you, Marc. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the intro, and thanks for having me here. It's an honor. Well, this is the book, and it's called Focus, and I should have given it a second thought, because there are like 200 or 300 books on Amazon all called Focus. I could have shown them as well. Maybe next slide. Somebody's there. Okay, there it is. But the reason I call this book Focus is because it's really defining ASML as a company. And they use focus in 5 dimensions. So first, they operate on a nanoscale. So their machine is literally about focus. I'll explain it later. And they only make one machine. So it's actually a one-trick pony of 350 billion market cap. And their other focus is the long-term vision, because their machines are usually built for to produce chips that are will wind up in our phones in about 10 or 15 years. So their roadmap is really, well, looking into the future. And the funny thing about focus is that you also have a lot of blind spots. And in the case of ASML, well, I discovered quite a few of them. And the last dimension of focus is that the company is now right in the spotlight. So this relatively obscure company, as the BBC reporter called it, is now front page news almost every day. Next slide. For this book, I traveled around most of the divisions of ASML. I visited their customers and their supply chain, and I wrote about ASML for my newspaper called NRC from the Netherlands. So I covered it for about a decade, and then during COVID, I got the opportunity to well, look behind the scenes for about a year. So I traveled around Europe, where most of their supply chain is, and also the US, Washington. Everything just went quite smoothly when I used these magic words, ASML, because then doors open. And also I visited China, of course, and TSMC in Taiwan, their main customer. Next slide. Okay, just a few numbers, and to give you a perspective on what ASML is actually doing. So if you look at the number of chips that are being produced worldwide, it's over 1 trillion, and 90% of these chips are made by using the copier of the chips, and that's ASML's machine. And their footprint is about 5,000 lithography machines. Lithography means writing with light. And the funny thing is, ASML designs the machine itself, but it uses a lot of sources from their suppliers. Like 80% of the value of the machine is being delivered by a supply chain with a lot of German companies. For example, Zeiss. You might know Zeiss from the prescription glasses. And the market share in EUV, Duncan already mentioned it. It's the technology that's being used to create these chips you find in AI chips, or, for example, your iPhone or your Samsung phone. And they really create chips that are based on the structure of 3 nanometers. And this is a kind of a weird number, especially when it comes to nanometers. But let's do some audience participation. Everybody reach out your hand and look at your fingernails. Now count to 3. It's an easy task. 1, 2, 3. So now you've seen your fingernail grow by 3 nanometers. So this is the amount of, well, the fine grainness of these machines by ASML. And they started out in the 80s, 84. And we'll get back to that later, because they really grew during this era in time where geopolitics didn't matter that much. And now they're an estimated like 42 plus employees, and they're expecting to double in size, I think about in the next decade, so 2030. And they have to grow according to their customers, which are the big chip suppliers. For example, Intel, Samsung, TSMC, SMIC from China. We get back to that later. And these chips are being used for AI, for data centers, for energy, for health technology, and for industry. And of course, our smartphones. And if you have heard these crazy numbers about the US or the EU investing in the semiconductor industry, they're talking about fabs that costed $10 billion. About 30% of that investment goes into the lithography machine. So that's a crazy amount. And if you just look at one particular individual machine, it can cost about 200 million euros to 400 million euros, which is the latest generation. And the funny thing is, I spent about 3 years behind the scenes at ASML. It's a multinational, but it still has this heartbeat of a startup, and that makes it a very special company. Okay, next slide. And this is not your the barbecue in your neighbor's backyard, but it's the first lithography machine that was been developed by Philips, the electronics company from the Netherlands, and ASML was a spin-off of Philips. Next slide. This was the machine they started out with. Wasn't particularly good or at its job, but it kind of forced the company to reinvent itself, and they had to combat competitors like Nikon and Canon, but also competitors from the US. Next slide. Well, this is the time of the moustaches, not the sideburns anymore. The 90s, that's when ASML started, the machine started growing and the company started growing as well. And the funny thing, next slide is the finer these structures on the chips are, the bigger the machine you need to create them. So this is the EUV machine, which was producing chips in high volume in around 2018, 2019. That's when these EUV chips started popping up in our iPhones, for example. Next slide. And this is their latest and greatest. It's just one machine building these chips, and it costs about 400 million euros. It's called a high-NA machine. You can forget about it or read it in a book. And this machine stretches about 40 meters. It's 5-6 meters high, and of course, it took about 10 to 15 years to build it. It has over, well, hundreds of thousands of little parts, and they all have to cooperate together. So Intel bought a couple of them, and now trying to get it to work. Okay, next slide. And this is not a scene from a James Bond film, but it's the Zeiss lab, this town in the neighborhood of Stuttgart, in the southern part of Germany. They had to build a lab with these huge, I always describe them as submarines sawn in half. But they use them to measure the mirrors that are like the basic optic system of the lithography machine. And they create a mirror surface that is so flat that if you were to point a laser at it, you could hit a golf ball on the moon. At least that's what the Germans promised ASML. And you see, they're a very important supplier of ASML, but there are over 800 suppliers. So when everybody's talking about ASML, that company that's kind of caught in this limbo between US and China, we're actually talking about 800 plus European companies. And it takes a lot of capital because it's a very expensive machine to build, and a lot of growth as well, because well, the Netherlands is just a Mickey Mouse country, as ASML describes it, and they have a hard time expanding in this rate that the semiconductor industry expands. Next slide. And this is Martin van den Brink. He was kind of the genius that was employee number 0, and he recently stepped down this year. So he was part of ASML for 40 years, and he was CTO, technical, responsible for all the technology. And he's a kind of a over-focused man, and he was a very challenging guy to interview. But I managed to get through to him, and he's also very challenging to you. So when I first stepped into his office talking about my plan to write a book, he said, "What? Why are you writing a book? There have been books written all over the place about semiconductors." And he was trying to get me out of his office. But it's his way of challenging you to do a better job. And he really created this culture of ASML that is, well, I'm from the media, so I'm used to deadlines, but there's really always a deadline lurking at ASML. And this is part of Dutch culture, but Dutch culture multiplied by lithography machines makes it kind of a, hard culture to deal with. And they call it, even have it in their own system. The Brink imitatiegedrag, or BIG, translated, it's bring imitation behavior. So a lot of people in the management of ASML, well, they figured that this is the way to handle people. And one of the things that also happened is ASML was so focused to delivering these machines in time, because there was a lot of pressure by the customers, that they didn't care that much about information security, for example, or logistics. Was just all not that interesting, because these people are engineers and they really like the hard problems. They don't like the, well, not so interesting problems. For example, Martin van den Brink, well, he quite often lost his phone in a cab, or lost his laptop in a plane, and always loses his passport. And this is a guy running the largest technology company of Europe. But he's left, and now it's time for a new era at ASML. Next slide. And ASML is caught in this spotlight, this international spotlight. And they had a hard time, well, adjusting to that, because, well, they have this engineer's mindset, and the company really wasn't interested in politics at all. Actually, they thought politics was harder to grasp than building a lithography machine. And now they are sucked into this technology war, and this kind of propelled the investments in the semiconductor industry as well, because all the continents that have seen the semiconductor industry move to Asia, especially Taiwan, want to build their own sovereign technology and their own sovereign semiconductor industry. So during the pandemic, a big chip shortage hit. Maybe you remember that you had a hard time getting your PlayStation, or when you ordered your car, you had to wait in line for about a year. And it kind of well, rang a bell with the politicians. Hey, maybe these chips are important for our society. That's because that's what triggered the EU and the US to spend huge amounts of money, so like billions and billions, into this new generation of chips. Last slide. Okay, now concluding, ASML is a monopoly, so it's the only company able to create these really advanced chips. And this is actually their own monopoly board game. They built a special edition. I found it in their archives. They're not so proud of it anymore. But the company really has like this formula. There's no ego, so you're supposed to challenge your leadership as well, which makes it quite a Dutch company, but also a company that's not hard, that's very hard to replicate in a different culture. There's no status. So what I was saying about Martin van den Brink, he also expects you to challenge him. That really was always on his mind. And there's no mercy, so they're really a customer for their suppliers that doesn't expect no for an answer, which means their suppliers are, well, have to adjust to these ups and downs in the chip industry. And, well, it makes it a very complicated and delicate economic system. And the funny thing is, there's no perfection. So if you buy one of these machines, one of these 400 million euros machines, you're sure about one thing: it doesn't work. Because ASML's strategy is to get the machine there right in time and to tweak it and to well, cooperate intensively with their customers and to produce the best results. This is what got them this far. This is how they outcompeted Nikon and Canon, for example, because Nikon also produces great digital cameras. They're well, they built lithography machines that were perfect, and you just had to put the plug in and it worked. But ASML has a different mindset, and by creating this tweaking relationship with their customers, they really got into the production lines and technology, which is now very much part of the the leading position of ASML because they gather data from all these lithography machines all over the world. And the funny thing, it's a really complex machine, but they don't consider it complex because if you admit it's hard to do, then you're not challenged to make it simpler. That's their mindset. And it's a company that doesn't have any borders. So if they're not allowed to grow in Netherlands, they'll move. If they're not allowed to expand in the country, they'll move because there's a demand for semiconductors. The demand is growing, so ASML has to grow accordingly. Just one thing they have to adjust, which is geopolitics.
Thanks, Mark. I'd invite the other speakers to come up to the stage. Thank you. That was excellent. It is a unique company, as you see. And you really nailed it. I mean, a monopoly, which is trying not to act like a monopoly in a sense, because they're very conscious of the risks of being a monopoly. And so there's a lot in the book actually about Dutch culture, also between the north, the Randstad, which is all the fancy cities we know, and Brabant in the south. So these are the country bumpkins a little bit, with the south, would you say?
Yeah, the south felt a bit less than the north of the Netherlands, where all the rich cities are. But they have, well, if you look at for big tech in the Netherlands, you have to look for Brabant, which is the province where ASML resides.
And we call this now Brainport. They're trying to brand this area as the Brainport.
Yeah, of course. Like we call Rotterdam, the harbor, we call it main port. Schiphol, the airport, is also like a main port. Mm-hmm. And so they figured in Eindhoven, where ASML is expanding, we call it Brainport, because we have to use our brains. And the funny thing is, if you talk to people at ASML, they also sometimes jokingly call them the center of all autism is there.
Yeah, that was interesting. It came out that a higher percentage than normal of people working in the company are either they have ADHD, which means they lack focus, which is
the whole spectrum. The whole spectrum aligns with that attitude.
Beautiful minds working on incredibly complex problems under intense pressure.
And I guess that's also one of the reasons that they developed sort of a monoculture, because they were attracting people that really like diving into these incredible complex physics and chemistry.
And hilarious scenes, actually, of the cross-culture clash. I was expecting a lot on Asia, which you get, but before that, you've got to understand, the clash with Zeiss, the German culture versus these guys. It's hilarious, basically, how challenging it is in Europe to construct a European identity in something like this. But they've done it with this company in terms of its impact. But Pierre. Is it? Sorry. Oops, I'm thinking that.
Technology.
No, we're all challenged.
Yeah. The funny thing in your presentation was this no ego. But now, as we are in Paris, ASML has a French CEO who just took over from the founders.
Christophe Fouquet.
Fouquet. And I was wondering whether he had forgotten his ego, because I don't know any French CEO.
Well, there's an earlier
have an
CEO.
ego.
I guess he left it on the plane as well. No, they already have experiences with French CEOs, because they had Eric Maurice back in 2000, I think 2009 to 2013. No, he was there for a longer time. And his favorite character was Napoleon, and which was very much in line with his, he called everybody incompetent, because it was an international phrase. You could use it for French, Dutch,
It's on.
I want to switch gears here a little bit. As we're talking about documentation, multiple nations, multiple cultures in Europe.
I don't think your mic is working, by the way. The green light.
Hello?
Yeah,
there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, so as Duncan mentioned, multiple cultures and multiple nations in Europe with different interests. We can start with the ending quote, which I think sets a beautiful context to this following discussion about geopolitics, which is, you said that the national blinders prevent member states from acknowledging the overarching value of ASML, right? And as a result, Europe is punching well below the weight in this technology war. Well, the U.S. definitely recognizes the significance in cutting off China from the advanced chips because it sees it as a national security threat, and also it has a sense of ownership because these technologies fundamentally blossom from U.S. research institutions as well as U.S. industries. But I know that from your book that ASML has a very different perspective, so I was wondering if you could paint a little bit of color on that.
Okay, yeah, let's give a bit of a historic background, because EUV technology, which is now a kind of the cutting edge technology, was developed around the world actually in research labs, so in Japan, Europe, and the US. And when you describe lithography machine, it's actually writing with light. So if you have a fine liner, you can write more fine lines, of course. And if you have like a thick, what is called, like a marker, then it's very hard to write fine lines. So comparing this fine liner with the light source, well, light is a wave as well, and EUV is a very fine light wave. So it really was a technology that was necessary to get to this next level and to keep Moore's law alive, which is doubling the number of transistors in a chip, the number of switches every 2 years. So the whole world was looking at EUV as a possible new technology. Intel, back then it was like the market leader, invested in these first prototypes, but they weren't able to get it into high volume production. Actually, it took ASML 15 billion euros in 15 years to get it to, well, somehow perfection. And they really had to cooperate with their main customers, which were TSMC and Samsung, in the way I just described. So EUV had an American start, but then it took like 15 plus years to make it a machine that actually works in a chip factory 24/7, every day of the year. And that's the thing that ASML accomplished. So from an ASML perspective, the claim by American politicians, for example, saying EUV was an American invention, well, they don't acknowledge it because, well, they think it's a European invention. And now everybody's depending, it's the European leverage and the technology that's only available because ASML helped produce it together with their supply chain. I think, getting back to your question, it really was the Americans that pointed out to Europe, do you even know what you have in your own backyard? Especially the Netherlands weren't really aware how important that machine was that was developed in the south of the Netherlands. So the US always had this strategic vision on this technology. And, well, the Netherlands are learning on the job, to speak, yeah.
It's really a book about going up against constraints. I mean, the company's bigger than the Netherlands. I mean, the government in the Netherlands, you described like they barely understand what's going on, you know, and the scale of it. Even the local government, the company is expanding at a huge rate, which is creating massive issues for traffic and so on. And energy consumption. I mean, it's amazing to think that one of the companies supplying the lasers already consumes the same as Stuttgart, just making these lasers.
Yeah, and they're quite proud of that number. And I thought, well, maybe you should try to make it less energy consumptive.
But I want to hand it to Pierre for a second. And you know, is there a growing? What Marc mentioned that the Netherlands doesn't even realize that what was in the backyard. Is there a growing recognition and awareness in the EU level as well? You know, I can't imagine with so much headlines coming out.
Well, today, obviously, there is, but that recognition came from the US, actually, and from the changing strategic landscape. And you refer in your presentation to the Sputnik moment. I don't know if everybody is aware what is a Sputnik moment. The Sputnik moment is a reference of, obviously, to the launch of the Sputnik by the Soviet Union in the late 50s, and which came as a total surprise to the US because they didn't realize that the Soviet Union had been so advanced in space technologies. And this was the first equipment to be put in orbit around the Earth. And what is called the Sputnik moment is this shock of realizing that a rival power has the capacity to be more advanced than you, being the US the number one superpower. And the Sputnik moment in the 50s had produced two institutions. One is very well known, is NASA. NASA was created after the launch of the Sputnik by the Soviet Union. And the second one is less well known by the general public, is DARPA. And DARPA, which has a multi-billion-dollar budget, has its job is to make sure that the US keeps one step ahead of everybody else in the advanced technologies and particularly in tomorrow's technologies. And that new Sputnik moment was 2015 when China produced the China 2025 document, in which, and I think some people should have been must have been executed in China for producing that document publicly, to make it public, because in that document, China was listing all the technologies in which it wanted to be the leader 10 years ahead, so 2015, 2025. And these were all the technologies that matter: semiconductors, robotics, AI, and so on. And that created the Sputnik moment in Washington, D.C., where people started looking at China as a country that could step ahead of the US in advanced technologies, and therefore dictate the norms, dictate the shaping of the world of tomorrow. And that really was the wake-up call in Washington, D.C. And you could date the countdown to ASML being taken over by the geopolitical tornado from that moment. So it started at the end of the Obama era on a very slow pace, and it went very fast with Trump. And for the general public, I think the starting point is not so much the document, but the detention of the CFO of Huawei, Mrs. Meng, in Vancouver. I think it was 2018. And that was really the signal, although she was arrested for breaking the Iran sanctions and not for anything dealing with the technology advancements, but still, Huawei was the most visible technology company in the US, in China. It was a leader in 5G technology, and therefore hitting the CFO of Huawei was symbolic for that, and was secondly symbolic because she was the daughter of the founder of the company. Therefore, she's a red princess, which means a lot in the Chinese context, as we know from Xi Jinping himself, for example. And therefore, from there on, we have a growing trend in the US to contain the rise of Chinese technologies. And the Biden administration has taken over from the Trump administration and has made it even more coherent, rational, systematic, organized. And there's not been a week without new regulations, new companies on lists, new finance circuits blocked, and so on. And therefore, that's when ASML comes in the picture.
Yeah, it's great to add to that at that time, the EUV machine, that was kind of, the US dropped the ball on EUV lithography, and they figured that the EUV machine was needed to create this a new generation of AI chips capable of, having great conversations with ChatGPT, but also creating missiles or defense systems. And they figured that ASML should stop selling, or no, prevent ASML from selling the first EUV machine to SMIC, the
Shanghai-based semiconductor company.
A semiconductor company from China. And that's
which had as a great leader at one stage the son of Hu Jintao.
Hu Jintao at one point, yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that EUV was blocked by the Americans, they had to make an agreement with the Dutch government because the export controls are like a national business in the EU. So there was a lot of diplomatic pressure from the US, and it caught the Netherlands by surprise.
And I think in your book, you also outlined the complexity of the export controls. And one interesting phenomenon that you raised in your book was the US was restricting ASML, a Dutch company, via export controls, but that, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally benefited Applied Materials, which is a US company, from getting much more Chinese business. And in fact, in August, I think in their Q3 earnings report, there was a huge growth in China for Applied Materials, right?
Okay, I can explain it if we just take an imaginary walk through a semiconductor factory. Then you see like this central tool, that's the lithography machine. It's like the oven in a bakery, so it's really the central tool. And around it are other machines that are used for adding extra layers. Because if you were to saw a chip in half, you see all these layers stacked upon each other, hundreds of layers. And this takes like thousands of different processes all gathered around this lithography machine. And when you can't use your lithography machine as much as you want to, so not for the finest lines, then you can create a very old trick stemming from the book press, actually. So you first print lines very wide apart, and then you do an extra print, and you print extra lines between them. So like you would do it with a book press. And this is a technology that was quite common in the semiconductor industry, but the Chinese company SMIC perfected it as well. So they're doing 3 to 4 extra steps, and they can create quite advanced chips with a little trick. And this trick actually was a lot of knowledge was coming from Taiwan, because it was a former employee of TSMC who went to Samsung first and then got acquired by SMIC. And that technology was, made Huawei, for example, even go way beyond the normal level of accuracy or fine grainness in chips. And this freaked the Americans out. And that's when they upped the game extremely, and also said, we need extra export controls for lithography. So I always describe it as like a litho limbo. So the bar is getting lower and lower for ASML to deliver these machines to China. You see that in their revenue as well.
And I mean, the culture of the company, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to add one thing, is because the main question mark, the question that someone could raise is, why should a Dutch company obey American sanctions or blacklists? And that's where we get into a more global picture. And actually, the Americans have this extraterritorial sanctions, which apply to any country or any company that has dealings with the US. And therefore, if ASML or the Dutch government didn't comply with the US demands, ASML would be left out of the US market, would be prohibited from using US dollars, would be prohibited from using, I suppose, some components which come from the US. It has, as we saw on the map, some companies.
It has 8,000 employees
Yes.
in the US.
It acquired a US company a few
Yeah,
years
Cymer.
ago.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so there's no way, even if we don't go into the security arrangements between Europe and the US, there's no way a company that has so much involvement with the US could resist a demand of such a strategic importance made by the US government.
And yet, the very culture of the company is about open approach to customers. It's a very interesting dilemma that they find themselves in, because their success comes from this open innovation concept.
Well, because they're the monopolists, they figured they call themselves like the Switzerland of lithography machines. So everybody can buy one, because there's just a couple of customers left. I think there are less than 10 customers, because these machines are so incredibly expensive. And they really can't afford to give an advantage to one of their players, because it would make the other customers not happy, so to speak. So they think they're the Switzerland, but of course they realize that they have to adjust to this new agenda. But the company was founded in the 80s. It grew through the 90s and the early 2000s, which was an era of geopolitical paradise when there was no pressure at all. So it really was not in their mind, not even in the back of their minds, that the world might change. And of course they're Dutch, so they want to sell as much as possible, and they want to have so many degrees of freedom. And just to follow up on your remark that the company is not capable of protesting, I think they do, and they have this reasoning that if they're not allowed to have a healthy revenue, the revenue you need to, for example, invest in new generations and to be able to out-innovate your competitors or out-innovate Chinese competitors, you need all the revenue you can get. And this is actually the argument that also US companies make, but they're less vocal than ASML because they're American.
I want to touch upon both of you guys, what you guys said, and have Pierre expand on this point. Why should a Dutch company or European company listen to the US in terms of export controls? Is China a major security threat to the EU, the same, or to Europe, Dutch government, the same way that it is to the US?
It's a huge question, and you have to dig a little bit in history, because it was not the case until not long ago that the Europeans didn't consider China as a security threat. It was a competitor. There were intellectual property issues. There were a lot of issues, but not so much security issues. And I'll tell you a small anecdote. When I was a correspondent in China in the early 2000s, and China was on board the Galileo project. Galileo is the European answer to the GPS. And China and India to put an investment, I think it was $150 million each, to have a share they were initial founding members of the Galileo project. And the US was furious. And they said, which means, which says a lot about the thinking of some circles in the US already at that time. They said, okay, so if we have a war between the US and China in the future, China will use data given by our European allies' satellites, and that's unacceptable. And the Europeans had to, I remember having seen the French chief of staff arriving in Beijing to negotiate an addendum to the contract where China was left out of the Galileo data in case of war. It was added afterwards, after the whole thing was signed. And China decided to pull out. And China is no longer a part of Galileo. It started its own project, which it finished before the Europeans had done theirs, but that's not surprising. And therefore, that security concern was not in the European mind in 20 years ago, but it was already in the US mind. And fast forward to recent times, when the European Commission put out its first strategy on China in 2019, China was described in 3 categories. It was a competitor in economic terms, it was a partner on global affairs, for example, climate change and issues like that, and it was a strategic rival. And that was a new thing in European thinking, that China was suddenly raised to the status of being a strategic rival. And the Chinese were furious, I must say, because Xi Jinping was in Paris shortly after that document was produced. There was this famous meeting where Macron invited Angela Merkel and Ursula von der Leyen. No, it was not von der Leyen, it was her predecessor in Paris to discuss with Xi Jinping. And there were pretty hot exchanges because the Chinese wanted Europe to drop this strategic rival. So the security issue was very late on European minds, and it hasn't left, because since then we've had the US putting permanent pressure for the Europeans to be on board. And Huawei, to come back to Huawei, was probably the issue on which the Europeans put the 5G. And there was this very interesting case with the UK. I'm sure Duncan knows.
GCHQ, yeah.
Because the British Secret Service had access, the Huawei opened every equipment to the British Secret Service to show that there was no backdoor, nothing suspicious, no spying device, nothing. And the British Secret Service made a report to the government saying, it's okay, we can buy Huawei equipment. And the US came behind and said no, and Huawei was banned from the UK market. and that probably was the first case where we saw how much pressure the US was ready to put on this China technology issue, and how little leverage the Europeans have, even if the UK was probably weaker because it was after Brexit and it didn't have the joint approach that Europe could have. But even Europe, I don't think, because we come back to the initial point, ASML is the only technology company that matters in Europe.
And it's the only leverage.
There's a lot of technology in Europe, but it's the only one of that size in the A category. And therefore, we depend on the US for everything else in technology. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. I'm making it darker than it is.
Some technology people in the room are thinking that they don't exist, but anyway.
Yeah, I was just wondering that I think there's leverage in the way that, for example, the US puts a lot of pressure on the Dutch government.
Yep.
But there's also the reasoning that if, for example, theoretically ASML were to be banned from China completely, then they really, well, if they can't acquire the technology through the front door, so to speak, there will be a lot of pressure on the information security. And this is really getting into ASML's minds already, that the more you push China away, the harder they will try to well, use hacking or employees stealing information. And you see ASML, well, growing up to be a mature company and create its defenses, which is it hasn't, because it has this history of being transparent, of being an engineer's culture, of opening up its doors to speed up innovation. If you build all these extra thresholds in the system, then you kind of clog up the innovation speed.
And they also learned a lot from the Taiwanese, right? I mean, the biggest customer, I guess, is TSMC. Overall.
Yes, yeah.
So the way, I mean, in TSMC you describe, it's a great book also, Understanding the Culture of Samsung, TSMC, as well as ASML, but within TSMC there is a zero trust environment. That is just literally, you can recognize TSMC employees by the plastic bags they take in and out, because nothing is going in and out of that plant without
they're very secretive, which makes sense because every big company, NVIDIA, Apple, even Intel, their competitor, produces their most advanced chips in Taiwan because they can't do it themselves. And TSMC has to keep all the customers apart from each other, so they're really locked down. So that's very much in the culture. And ASML is acting accordingly now, so it's building up a good defense. But they really are scared that if you take out the lithography technology in China, for example, by cutting off the surfacing. So these machines really need constant servicing. If you were to prevent people from keeping these machines running, they will stop down in a couple of weeks, and because they need constant attendance. This is what the Americans really want. They want ASML to stop servicing, but this is way too far because if these machines would stop, then China would have no other option but to build its own technology.
And it would hit the US in terrible ways, right? There would be global problems with supply.
So we're now on this, this pivotal moment that it started out with the US being afraid of AI and these really advanced chips being made in China, but it's now shifting towards more mature technology, so older technology. And the US is afraid that there might be the same result as, for example, solar cells or EVs that are being overproduced in China and then kind of drive the whole market down and create an advantage for China in the end. And ASML is caught right in the middle of this.
I think we'd like to open the floor to questions. One has already come in from Zoom, which is kind of related, which is about outsourcing. Like, how much does ASML shift production to non-aligned countries? The question that came online was about Malaysia, which is also being courted by Chinese. I don't think yet Malaysia, but Malaysia is emerging as a new, once again, player in this industry. So how is this playing out? Like, where are they? We had the map earlier, but are they going to, because the scale, they're even outgrowing the region of the Netherlands they're in, or even outgrowing Europe.
Yeah, well, ASML is where its customers are. So they are always expanding. For example, you see in Arizona, I visited Phoenix, the Phoenix area where TSMC is building huge fabs, and also Intel is expanding. So ASML is also expanding in that area.
Are they going to Kumamoto in southwest Japan? Because
yes, they are, because it's the only way the Japanese can also step up their game and get into highly advanced chips as well.
Right.
And so ASML is just following the industry. And the industry has been moving to China to Asia for 40 years because of geopolitics and also because of their culture, because it's very hard to run a semiconductor factory. It really takes discipline. And if you look at the discussions about Arizona, where Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, he actually, his whole professional career was at TI, Texas Instruments in the US, and he was really not happy with the fact that TSMC was expanding in Arizona because they said it's more expensive and the people don't have the right attitude to run a chip fab.
There's no water also, which is what you need.
Well, I think...
they recycle, you described.
I researched it, and I think the water deal is a bigger issue in Taiwan, actually, than in Arizona.
Yeah, that's true.
I think, actually, this is a great segue because, with the de-risking and stuff like that, of course, Europe is also trying to, it has its own CHIPS Act and it's trying to open up its own chip manufacturing capacity. ESMC just dug into the ground. In the US, the CHIPS Act hasn't been very successful, right? And Intel just laid off 15,000 people. there was an acquisition proposal by Qualcomm. Like, do we expect ESMC to, I mean, as you said, it's very difficult to...
Maybe we should share a little bit background. So TSMC, the largest foundry, so that's a company that builds other companies' designs, manufactures them, based in Taiwan, is expanding worldwide. So it's building a Japanese dependence and also in Europe it's called ESMC, European Fab, and it's expanding in Arizona.
Yeah.
And they don't double in size, but they have this de-risking strategy. About 10 to 15% of a mother factory in Taiwan is being copied to another place, and I think this is just a very small amount if you look at the total demand for chips and the total footprint of TSMC. But it's necessary to keep these relationships with the countries in an okay state. I think this death spiral Intel is in right now is based on the fact of that cultural difference I was talking about, that Asia really has this risky attitude of being wanting to be the first with a new technology, and Intel was always the market leader. It really, it was the company that built the chips for your laptops and your PCs, but they dropped the ball on mobile phones.
Yeah.
They were asked by Apple, "Can you build a chip for our iPhone?" back in 2007 or 6. They said, "No, there's no market in there." And they also...
we see the rise of ARM, and we've seen it, yeah.
Well, NVIDIA is now obviously leading the AI revolution when it comes to the semiconductors. And Intel is trying to hold on. But it's not in a good place right now because it's in the company's nature to be risk averse because they were market leader. So they had this incumbent effect. And even though they propelled the first start of the EUV machine, like the Americans always say, they were very hesitant to use these EUV machines in their systems. They kind of held on to their existing technology of, creating these double lines in books.
But it's also about work culture, right? I mean, I think TSMC, when they first hit the ground in Arizona, they were very vocal about concerns about work culture. Maybe Pierre can talk a little bit about that. I mean, because Europe has a very different work culture from Asia.
Being very polite here, different work culture.
I don't know what you're talking about.
More wine. No, sorry.
But the interesting, and then I think there are questions in the audience, but the interesting thing about these delocalizations by TSMC is that it raised geopolitical issues too. And there was a huge debate in Taiwan about the fact that people were arguing if our productions, our secrets are going to the US or Europe or Japan, the US will have no incentive to defend us in the future because they won't need Taiwan as for what it does best, which is semiconductors. And the government had to calm down the debate in the island about that, saying we are still keeping our technology one step ahead in Taiwan compared to what we are building in Arizona. And the TSMC leadership was, I think, popularizing this work culture issue, also to show Taiwanese that we can't trust Arizona to replace Taiwan as the main center.
And Pierre, we actually had Maurice Chang came to Asia Society last year, actually. You know, he's now 93, and we had him with Joe Tsai, actually, in a sort of discussion in New York at Asia Society, both public and a little private one. And, you know, Maurice Chang, as you said, he was at Texas Instruments. He didn't actually found the company, TSMC, until his 50s, right? And he had actually never been to Taiwan until his 50s.
Quite a midlife crisis.
Yeah,
eh?
and the one thing I was to the point that he is, so there's still hope for those of you who are in the 50s.
He was born in
China.
Beijing.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But one thing he said, why did he go to Taiwan? And he said it was the apprentice system. So the fact that there were, craftsmen, it doesn't necessarily mean high-end PhDs. It was actually the crafts, that sort of apprentice thing, which is a big challenge. Sometimes in Europe is an advantage we see in certain countries. So maybe that's something to look at.
And just to follow up on Pierre, one thing I discovered in the book is that there's this logic that every time that TSMC promised to build a new factory in Arizona, then there's a huge weapons deal afterwards.
Yeah.
And so there's really a quid pro quo in that.
And they've already built 2 in Kumamoto, which is in Kyushu. If you go to southwest Japan near Fukuoka, this area is booming, already built 2.
But it's really the American defense.
Yes, there's a quid pro quo on this. So we'd like some questions from the floor. I think, Bruno, we have a question here.
Thanks, Duncan. My name is Bruno. The question for Marc regarding the book. What do you call brink imitation behavior? And a second side question, what's the lead time for these machines, assuming that, let's say I'm a customer in Asia where there's no ASML factory, how long does it take to get a machine?
Okay, let's start with the last question. So usually the lead time is longer for the more complex machines. But it takes about 3 to 6 months to build a machine, but they have this horrible logistics system that they first build up the machine entirely in Veldhoven, the little town in Brabant, and then they test it and they tweak it until everybody's satisfied, and they tear it up completely again and put it in plane. Actually, 7 planes. Yeah,
7 747s for one plane. So Bruno, I don't know how big your home is.
And they have to rebuild it, and rebuilding it and adjusting it, and because even gravity matters, and because these machines are so sensitive, they're the best predictors of earthquakes, actually, because all these chips have to be accurate and fault-free, error-free on this nanometer level of your fingernails. So building a machine doesn't take that much time. It's really testing, pre-testing, and getting it to work, and getting the yield up, and the throughput, the amount of chips you can, wafers you can start. Wafer, it's the silicon disk. And back to the brink imitation behavior, it really is not an official term. It's the term that people at the inside of ASML use because, well, it really, it's an exclamation culture. People shout at each other usually, and they stop that. Yeah, that's like this.
In California, they have cultural issues, right? Because they're so direct.
Yeah,
the Dutch, the Californians are used to it.
So people in California work for ASML because they have a couple of factories there and labs. They got used to this Dutch way of working, or the ASML way of working, but they shared with me that they never treat their neighbors or their family members in this way because it's horrible. And,
Dutch people are very nice, but sometimes they can be very
And
direct.
I can testify that with my friend Ruud from Brabant. The more beers flow, the more direct he gets.
Yeah, and it's I think it's also part of their I hate to say the word, but it has an autistic attitude to dive into these really deep problems and to be able to do some really operate on this verge of science and economics. That's what they do. So it's a really hard task, and the only thing that matters is who has the best solution to these hard problems. So it's also about competition between engineers, and they want to compete for the most budget or the most talented employees to help them out figure their part of the problem. And the only way to get things done is by shouting at each other.
But, I mean, you described the neurodiversity, there are people, as we said, on the spectrum who it made me think that if China is going to try to replicate any bits of this.
Well, they managed to shouting, but...
yeah, they shout.
I guess...
tolerance for, like, eccentricities, people
but
who are...
the fact that you have to challenge your leadership to get the best solution up there, to have discussion, really is is part of Dutch culture, and the fact that it's a company that is so much relying on its suppliers. There's a lot of knowledge and value of the system within the supply chain, and the only way to get it done is well, to have this Rhinish attitude, het Rijnland model, we call it in Dutch. Countries like Switzerland, Germany, I guess France as well, and the Netherlands, they have another attitude than, for example, the Anglo-Saxon way of, well, trying to get as much profit as possible. So ASML profit is like a consequence. It's,
Right.
it's not a
Accidentally
goal.
profitable.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And this is another attitude. So they really want to keep that ecosystem alive.
Should we take more questions from this side? Yes, sir. I think there's a microphone coming, because we have people online. And more questions
you
from
can
online
shout,
as well.
I'm
No,
not
we'll need
afraid.
it for the online. Or be Dutch, yeah. Please.
Thanks. My name is John Krieger. I'd like to ask just a comment on what Pierre said and a question for Marcus. Pierre, thanks for mentioning these export controls are extraterritorial, which means that ASML's hands are tied by American law, which applies to them if they try to export in any direction which American firms can't export. And these sanctions are important. I mean, your dollars are frozen through the SWIFT system. You're denied access to the American market. So it really is a challenge to European sovereignty, this export control system. And I don't think Europeans are aware of it, and they should really stand up and defend themselves around it. My question for you, Marcus, is this. Of course, the Dutch responded to this. I think her name is Leslie Schielmacher, by saying that the Dutch adapted their own export control regulations to align themselves with the United States. And she claimed that this was also a question of national security for the Netherlands. But Peter Wennink, who was a CEO a few years ago, got up and publicly said the Dutch had surrendered to United States pressure. And I wondered if you could just discuss tension between the management of the company and the government in following American policy, and what kind of tension there is between management and the government over this issue.
So just repeat the question, because some people online are having a hard time. So tension between the management and the government,
Dutch government,
in the Netherlands as well.
Yes.
Sorry, just answer the first part briefly. I think what you're saying is raising the issue which I think Europeans are not discussing at the moment, which is, do we share the same vision as the US of the China threat? And because I think there are two sides to that. One side is the competition, unfair competition, or whatever we could share with the US in speaking to the Chinese about some of their practices, for example, and that's common to many countries. The other side is the US wanting to remain the biggest superpower, and so does that matter to Europeans that the US remain the only superpower? That's a matter for debate.
November 5th, we will make a decision.
But the problem is that debate is being preempted by the extraterritorial regulations, which means that even if we disagree, we have no choice, because our overall security is guaranteed by the US. And therefore, we have no other option. Or you question the whole NATO and everything that goes together. So that's the issue, which is much broader than just semiconductors, which is already a big one.
So to follow up on your question, you could describe ASML as like the insurance policy for the Americans helping us out in Ukraine, or on this geopolitical level, because Europe doesn't have the same amount of defense industry as the US, of course. When you talk about the pressure from the US, of course, it's on the Dutch government, but ASML is also trying to explain that by altering its possibility to sell enough machines to keep it a prosperous business, it will affect the innovation level of the entire industry, because the lithography machine really is the central tool when it comes to being able to out-innovate competitors. So they call it educating. And you were talking about relationships. Well, one of the relationships is ASML has all this data. You remember I was talking about the footprint of 5,000 lithography machines, and most of them, they send their data to Veldhoven so they can, well, for example, predict when there is new maintenance necessary. So ASML really has this oversight of the entire industry. And when you start pulling and pushing into this supply chain, it will create bigger problems. And that's the thing ASML is trying to explain to the Dutch government and also is trying to explain to Washington. And in fact, you could conclude that even though there are export controls right now, these export controls still are not completely like a zero-sum game. And there's another argument. If you were to copy the semiconductor industry supply chain everywhere around the world, then it really takes down the pace of innovation because it's a capital-intensive industry. We don't have enough talent in the world. Every country is fighting for talent, so it really is not possible to replicate everything Taiwan is doing right now. And I think that's something that is not in the mind of politicians. For example, the US government is trying to decouple and expecting to be able to build a resilient, highly advanced semiconductor supply chain for itself. Well, it will take a while before they get there. And this is one of the arguments ASML makes to, well, to slow down the pace of these export controls.
I mean, it's a very international company, even in the Netherlands, right? You have cricket teams of Indians, Pakistanis, you have like, so much as ASML is going around the world is coming to Eindhoven.
It's not a Dutch company. Right. Of course, it started out with Philips, but really it's like a global village if you walk. So it really has changed what you
I think Capucine has a
more questions.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Capucine.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My question is more oriented towards China. I'd love to understand better the Chinese response to all of this. Have they started developing a lithography machine? I mean, Comac came out with an airplane quite recently. How far are we from maybe a Chinese firm coming out with a lithography?
Excellent question. The Chinese have a competitor for ASML. It's called SMEE, S-M-E-E, and the company started out early 2000s, and they even bought a machine from ASML and tried to rip it apart and yeah, see how things are done. And they really have a hard time building technology that's even remotely as advanced as ASML's. But now they're with their back against the wall. Of course, there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of money flowing into this company. And Huawei is developing itself to like this director of the semiconductor industry in general in China. So there's a response. It kind of refocuses China on the deal. Well, we were heavily dependent on buying chips because that's where we started back in 2015. China had to import lots. It spent more on importing chips than on oil, I think. Yeah. So that really was like this economic necessity for them to, or for China to create a more resilient supply chain of itself. And they're shifting their attention from highly advanced chips to the chips that are needed for EVs, for example, or for climate change. And I think, well, may sound a bit corny, but one of the things that China is has proven to be capable of is really upping the game on, for example, solar cells, on building EVs. That's the cars we need. Okay, they're not from Europe or from the US, but actually it's the kind of cars our climate needs. So these are good things happening as well with the chip technology that's been made in China. And I think that's one of the arguments that ASML is trying to bring along.
There's a recent headline of, I think we were talking about it from the summer, the AMEC chairman saying that he thought that it would take 10 years, but by this summer that they would be able to achieve basic self-sufficiency, whatever that means, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, you describe in the book that there is only one way to win the technology race. You just run faster than your opponents,
Yeah.
right? Do not gamble on the idea that your security will always be airtight or that your patents will always be respected in China. That would be naive, you know. So there's an interesting, sort of a Dutch practical message from CEOs to the US government as well, which is part of this story as well. I mean, they are actually talking quite frankly to the US government and being...
Well, Peter Wenning, the former CEO, he also stepped down this year. He said, well, where's your self-confidence? And he said it to the US. So why are you trying to prevent other companies from also building a supply chain if you're not confident of yourself? But of course, there's a reason, because Intel, once the market leader, is not doing as well. That's why the US has this CHIP Act that tries to get TSMC aboard to get the most advanced technology from TSMC and from Samsung. And getting back to your point from China, China is rapidly building chip factories around the country in a pace that it's very hard to describe.
I want to ask you guys a philosophical question, because earlier this year I saw a video of the chairwoman of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and she said that every time we cut something else and China cuts off something else, you make conflict more likely, not less likely, because you cut off everything, you got nothing to lose, and I don't think that's a very comfortable situation amongst great powers. As we're discussing ASML as a strategic company, like big multinational in a strategic sector, do we see an evolving role in these multinationals play in foreign policy? These tech companies, even Silicon Valley, these tech companies, they don't have a history of heavy lobbying, but those companies are becoming much more lobbying heavy in the US. Do we see an evolving role? Do we want an evolving role for companies like ASML to play maybe perhaps a mediating role?
This is a very complex question, because we are in the middle of a very ambiguous moment. You have a company like Tesla. It's a technology company. It has a huge investment in China. It's been, I don't know if it still is, but it's main market for a while. It's the largest market. Elon Musk is a very vocal character, as we see during the campaign, and therefore he is a lobbyist. For example, Taiwan knows that they will never get access to Starlink if there's a war, the way Ukraine did, because Elon Musk has too much at stake in China itself. So that's one example of a major company that has a very geopolitical role. But you have other companies that have been kept out of the Chinese market, for example, or who failed in the Chinese market. Amazon, for example, is not that big in China because it lost the game to local companies. And therefore, I think you don't have a unified multinational company attitude towards China. The government is taking the risk, as the quote you gave mentioned, of creating two worlds. The de-risking strategy, rather than decoupling, but at least in technology, will mean that in the future you're going to have two worlds. You have the world of the Chinese technology and the world of the Western technology. And you can see it in the telecom today. Huawei has lost the Western world, but is overwhelmingly present in Africa,
Middle East,
in the Middle East, in Latin America, and therefore you have a dual world, divided world, and that's the logic of the Cold War, and we are by many respects in a new Cold War, not in every respect, but in some, and certainly technology is today the basic battleground for this Cold War, and I think that's what's going to happen. you're going to have these two worlds that will develop in parallel ways, when a few years ago we thought globalization was a global field.
And Mark actually describes this as going from the Iron Curtain to the Silicon Curtain, which I thought was a nice way, on either side of the Silicon Curtain. I thought that was a good...
Yeah, just to follow
Tweetable.
up on that, I describe ASML as like this Dutch high-tech fairy tale, because it was never the intention of the company to grow into...
it's accidental.
But they have been living in La La Land for quite a while, and now they have to adjust. And of course, regulation is usually part of these big companies, like telecoms is very much regulated, and so it makes sense that regulating these companies and this technology is being applied. But I think the question is, it's being applied by whom? So is it the US telling us, Europeans, how we should handle this European fairy tale? Or should we try to do it ourselves? And I think you refer to the conclusion of the book that really the EU is not being tough enough on this subject. So the Netherlands is not trying to wait for the EU, but they're trying to build this coalition of the willing. New Secretary for Economic Affairs. I recently interviewed him for NRC, and he described his intention to create bonds with Germany, France, Belgium, but also Poland and Italy. These are all our European companies with huge aspirations for semiconductor industry, and they try to make take a firmer stance against these extraterrestrial export controls.
We'll take one last question. Yes,
extraterritorial.
Yeah,
Thank you.
hi, Stephen Wolf. It seems to me that this is another case of globalization adding friction to world trade. But what I'd really like to know is, does it do more than just add cost? How important are these technologies, or can the Chinese work around them? Can they live with bigger chips or multiple chips rather than just having one of the best? I mean, this is obviously the Rolls-Royce, but can you work with a couple of Fords instead? Because, I mean, I worked in China for many years and lived in China for almost a decade. And Chinese economics don't work the same way as everyone else's economics. So if it's just a matter of the way we see cost, then that may not be that important to the Chinese. It will be important if it's a difference in capability, but not necessarily in economic cost. I'm just interested in your comment.
Well, I completely agree that there's a very pragmatic attitude towards problems that are being created, and just find another way around to achieve the same goal. And for example, you don't even have to buy the Rolls-Royce to use your analogy, but you can even rent them. So Chinese companies can still rent AI power and these supercomputers at Amazon or Microsoft. Of course, it's not the same as having your own supply chain and being able to crank out highly advanced chips at a huge scale. But it's one way of getting around the problem. And of course, economics in China are different, but the intention made in China hasn't changed, I think. So they really want to master that technology. And if you create a market that's big enough, then there's also enough capital for a company like SMEE to create enough capital and get to the next phase of these steps of nanometers. Actually, it's stepping down the nanometer scale. And they'll find their way. That's why ASML always says we have to out-innovate them. You can't expect them to stop and say, okay, we give up. So you got to speed up the pace.
And our friend, the former ambassador...
Sorry, just one word. Don't forget that these are dual technologies. That's right. That they also apply to the military.
Everything is, right?
And anyone who has read Cheap War, and I hope you read that book because it's fascinating.
And Chris Miller endorses his book, and so there's
Yes,
a mutual.
it's another. It's the sister book to
Yes, it is.
Focus.
You have to, if you buy one, you buy two.
You realize that when semiconductors were invented, they were useless. No one knew what to do with them until space and ballistic missiles arrived, and they got contracts, and the industry was born out of NASA and the Pentagon, and therefore the Chinese will want the most efficient, most productive equipment for their military, because that's why they will want the Rolls-Royce and not the Ford.
Yeah, can I just add to that? That lots of developments were started out in the early days in the 50s and the 60s with the defense industry trying to get the best semiconductor technology as an alternative to vacuum tubes and stuff like that. But defense is just a very small portion of the total amount of semiconductors. There's 1 trillion plus chips every year. And so ASML is specialized in, well, doing mass production, which is the chips you use for daily life, and they can also be used for AI to create weapons or improve weapons. But so the innovation has shifted from the defense industry to the consumer industry.
Our good friend, the former ambassador to China for Portugal and France and many other places.
I just want to make a very, very quick comment, and following what Pierre Haski was saying, that these questions between geopolitics, the security dimension, as in the case of the relationship between Europe and the United States, as of course also the NATO element. And I just thought that is ironical that the head of government that had to deal with the requests of the Americans is now the Secretary General of NATO.
Oh, yeah. You mean Marc Rutte?
Marc Rutte, yeah.
He's one of the, not a protagonist in the story, but he's one of the main players.
But that shows something.
Yeah. Well, there's this feeling, but that's not often being pronounced out loud, that this was already in the books, the fact that Rutte was expecting a new job at NATO. And of course, you need the US approval for that. But things have shifted since Brexit, because it used to be the UK that was the most trustworthy transatlantic ally for the US, and now it's the Netherlands. And Rutte is a proof of that.
I think we're running out of time, and if you work in ASML, I like the point that you make. You have to wear these, of course, you're in extreme clean environments. You have to wear these suits, and it's not a place for people with small bladders like myself, because it's actually not worth, they say, getting out of the suit, going out, coming back, so some of us may be needing the bathroom here as well. But I wanted to thank everybody in the room. Firstly, as you describe it, ASML makes incomprehensible equipment for an equally incomprehensible market. So thank you for staying this long. Thank you, Mark. And thank
I
you,
just want to
Pengfei.
make one last comment. So, these events are not easy to put on. The team worked really, really hard to put on these events. So if you believe in what we do, and if you want to support us, please approach any of us to talk, to learn more about the patient program. There's also books back there for purchase by Mark as well. So yeah, thank you all for coming.